Thank you. Good morning to the few that are here this morning. I guess I was expecting that a little bit, but that's a good thing, because maybe we can give a little more time to certain facts, to certain points that we'll be talking about this morning. So, take out your Bibles. We are obviously still on Matthew. Page 50, chapter 18, verses 1 to 14. So there are three things we'll be covering today. First, who is the greatest in the kingdom? Second, temptations and scandals. Thirdly, the lost sheep. So we have a lot to go over. So let's read it together. That's page 50, chapter 18, verses 1 to 14. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus saying, "Who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" Then Jesus called a little child to him, set him in the midst of them, and said, "Assuredly I say to you, unless you are converted and become as little children, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Therefore, whoever humbles himself as this little child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one little child like this in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and if he were drowned in the depths of the sea. Woe to the world because of offense, for offense must come, but woe to that man by whom the offense comes. If your hand or foot causes you to sin, cut it off and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life lame or maimed, rather than having 2 hands or 2 feet to be cast into the everlasting fire. And if your eye causes you to sin, pluck it out and cast it from you. It is better for you to enter into life with 1 eye, rather than having 2 eyes to be cast into hellfire. Take heed that you do not despise one of these little ones, for I say to you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountain to seek the one that is straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so is not the will of your Father who is in heaven, that one of these little ones should perish." So that's a big chunk we're taking today and looking at. But the 3 points that we are going to investigate are, what do the disciples mean by who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Secondly, the scandals and temptations about causing others to sin. And thirdly, that Christ has love and that he'll go to any length to get one of us, if that means he'll leave the flock for a little while, because he will rejoice over that one who went astray. This chapter 18, is very important for Christian ethics, because it deals with those qualities which should characterize the personal relationship of the Christian. So there are 7 qualities we can find here. 1 is humility. Only the person who has the humility of a child is a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. So Christ says, unless you are converted and become as little children. So he's asking us to become like kids, but in a certain sense. Personal ambition, personal prestige, personal publicity, personal profit. Do we find a link here? What word am I repeating? Personal. Our motive, which can find no place in the life of a Christian. The Christian is a person who forgets self in his devotion to Christ and his service of his fellow men. Forget this personal stuff. It's not about us, in other words. It's about the service to other people. The second quality is responsibility, verses 5 to 7. The greatest of all sins is to teach another person to sin, especially if that person is younger or weaker and less experienced. The Christian is constantly aware that he is responsible for the effort of his life, his deeds, and his words by his example to people. So we have a responsibility not to teach other people to sin. That's a responsibility. The third quality is self-renunciation, or giving up that which you have, verses 8 to 10. A Christian is like an athlete, for whom no training is too hard, if by it he may win a prize. So, we are like athletes if we have, and our training is not difficult for us because we have a prize to win or gain. Let's say not win, let's gain. The Christian is ready surgically to exercise from life everything which would keep him from rendering a perfect obedience to God. So we are like athletes. We have to work, we have to exercise. But it's according to that obedience to Christ that we need to have. We work in our obedience to Christ to gain that which He's promised. Not for self, not for ourself. I guess not for ourself. The fourth quality is individual care, verse 11 to 14. The Christian realizes, we know that God cares for us individually, and that he must reflect that individual care in his care for others. So in other words, we need to reflect our care that care which Christ has for us, we need to reflect to other people. Not in terms of crowds, but of persons, but of people. For God, no man is unimportant, and no one is lost in the crowd. For the Christian, every man is important and is a child of God, who, if lost, must be found. Now the fifth, that's verses 15 to 20. Christian kindness and Christian forgiveness do not mean that a man who is in error is to be allowed to do as he likes. Such a man must be guided and corrected if need be, disciplined back in the right way. But that discipline is always to be given in humility and in love, and not in a self-righteous condemnation, not to gain praise for ourselves, but in humility and in love. Always given with the desire of reconciliation and not for vengeance. We help someone to reconcile with them, or to help them reconcile with whatever they may be struggling with. And not to point out, see what you did wrong? This is how you ought to have done that. That's not humility, nor is that love. That's ego. I want to know that I made you feel better, so I feel better about myself. So our discipline is very important, that we are guided in the correct and proper way through love and humility. What did I say? 7. I'm on 6 now. Fellowship. The sixth quality is fellowship, verses 19 to 20. Christians are people who pray together. We come here to the church to be together, to pray together. People who in fellowship seek the will of God. Who in fellowship listen and worship together. Individualism is the opposite of what it means to be Christian. The church is a body. It is not a person. It's made up of people, but it creates one body. It's a fellowship of love, of reconciliation, of sacrifice, and of that common goal of seeking the will of God. And seventhly, the spirit of forgiveness, verses 23-35. I know I'm going beyond what I've spoken about, but this is a, let's say, overview of the entire chapter of 18. The Christian's forgiveness of his fellow men is founded on the fact that he himself is a forgiven man. He forgives others even as God, for Christ's sake, has forgiven him. So there needs to be the spirit of forgiveness, and we need to know what that spirit is, that Christ forgives us so that we may forgive others. So now let's get into a little of the meat of this, and we'll begin with chapter 18, verses 1 to 4. This question, who then is greatest in the kingdom of heaven, is an interesting question. But it indicates a selfish interest in worldly power. Christ points to a little child as the model of true discipleship, and he emphasizes the virtues required for entrance into the kingdom of heaven. This lesson would be more obvious to the disciples because of the word child and servant are the same in Aramaic. So they would be able to understand what Christ meant more so when he said child, because child and servant are the same. Humility, dependence, lowliness, simplicity, obedience, and a willingness to love and be loved. These are qualities that kids have, that children have. Humility, dependence, lowliness, simplicity, obedience, and a willingness to love and be loved. Christ warns the disciples that they are going in a completely wrong direction by asking, who's greatest in the kingdom of heaven? This indicates that the disciples have no clue what the kingdom of heaven is. And Christ said, unless you turn, unless you are converted, focus yourself on forgetting selfish ambitions and a life of service, not power. In life, it is all a question of what we as people are aiming for. What is our goal in life? We all have ambitions, we all have thoughts. What that big gold trophy is going to be at the end of our life. As we have said, fulfillment of personal ambition, personal power, personal prestige, again, personal. The exaltation of oneself are precisely the opposite of the kingdom of heaven. To be a citizen of the kingdom means to completely forget yourself. The obliteration of yourself, the spending of self in life with aims at service and not power. So we need to forget it's for ourselves and that it's for the other person. We can't find salvation by ourselves. It's impossible. But we can find it with the person sitting next to us, the person sitting in front of us and the person behind us. So long as a man considers his own self the most important thing in the world, his back will always be turned on the kingdom. If he ever wants to reach this kingdom, he must turn around and face the opposite direction. So Christ says, unless you turn from your ways of thinking of worldly power, who's to be greatest, it's because of the world. We think of kings and queens in the hierarchy to be great. But Christ said, unless you don't think of that way, unless you don't think of the kingdom in that sense, and become like little children, to be in humility, to be dependent, to lower yourself, to live in simplicity, to be obedient, and to love. Unless we don't have these qualities, then we don't have a place in the kingdom of heaven. So, Christ brought up this kid, this child. He stood him in the center where all could see him, and Christ declares that those who are proudly concerned for their status in the world must turn and repent and become like one of the kids. Otherwise, they'll never enter the heavens. Children in those days had no more social status than slaves. So here, where child and servant, let's say, a servant is a slave, come into play. Children had no more social status than a slave. That's interesting. Christ is comparing us to slaves or servants. Not slaves, I think, in the negative sense, but servants in a positive sense, in a selfless act of doing things. So the disciple must rein themselves to having no status in the world and to being marginalized or diminished and despised. People are not going to like us because of what we believe and because of how we act. It's interesting. Sometimes when I see it sometimes when I'm nice to someone, they have no clue what to do with that. This person's being nice to me. Oh no, I'm just going to turn around and be horrible to him and just continue to say bad things because I was expecting him to turn around and curse me out. Who knows, whatever it may be. It's very interesting that people don't know what to do with love. Their concern for who would be greater, this is the disciples, than his fellow is utterly inconsistent with their discipleship. There are many characteristics in a child which mark the man of the kingdom, which mark the person, the prototype of the kingdom. The power to wonder, the power to forgive, the innocence, and only to do something. There are three great qualities which make a child the symbol of those who are citizens in the kingdom. And those are humility, dependence, and trust. First, humility. We hear about humility all the time. But let's think of it in the sense of a child. A child does not wish to put himself forward. Rather, he wishes to face into the background. He doesn't wish to be up front. He wishes to be in the back. He does not wish for prominence, but he would rather be left in obscurity. It is only as he grows up and begins to become initiated into a competitive world with its fierce struggles and scramble for prizes for the first place that his instinct of humility is left behind. So in other words, as children, we don't wish to put ourselves forward. They don't wish to put themselves out in the open, but rather to be hidden and not to have a place of prominence. But it's only that society, growing up in society, teaches us to start focusing on ourselves and on that prize, which is for us and can only be attained by us, that the instinct of humility has left our being. Secondly, dependence. This is a perfectly natural state for a child. Kids are dependent on their parents. They can't take care of themselves when they're really, really young. They can never think of life by themselves. They are perfectly content being dependent on those who love and care for him or her. If we would accept the fact that our dependence on God is a strength, a new peace would enter our lives, a new peace, to be peaceful. So our dependence must become like a child's, that they're dependent on their parents. We call God our Father, so that a peace enters our hearts, enters our beings, because children are peaceful when they're with their parents. What happens when a kid is crying? The father or the mother go over to them, maybe pick them up, maybe spoil them a little bit by picking them up so much and not allowing them to cry and be on their own. But there's that knowledge, that dependence that the child always will have their parents to be there for them. Thirdly, trust. The child is instinctively dependent, and just as instinctively, he trusts his parents that his needs will be met. We kind of just touched on that. When we are children, we can't buy our own food, our own clothes, or maintain a home. Yet we never doubt that we'll be clothed, that we'll be fed, and that we will always have a shelter with warmth, comfort waiting for us when we get home. There's a trust here. We trust our parents that they'll take care of us, and we see that. When we are children, we set out on a journey that has no means of paying the fare and with no idea of how to get to our journey's end. Yet it never enters our minds to doubt that our parents will bring us home safely, or to bring us to that the end of our journey safely. The child's humility is the pattern of the Christian's behavior with his fellow man, with his fellow woman. And the child's dependence and trust are the pattern of Christian attitudes towards God. So, in this sense, Christ is saying, become like children. Be humble. Be dependent. And be trustful. Have those three qualities that a child has, and you will enter the kingdom of heaven. Notice how all these qualities weren't about the kid himself. They were not selfish. They are not selfish motives. But they're innocent. It's this innocence Christ is speaking of. And we'll get into this innocence, I believe now, with scandals and temptations. So now verses 5 to 10. The great keynote of this pericope is the terrible weight of responsibility it leaves on each one of us. We have a responsibility. Who's afraid of this responsibility? I'm afraid of this responsibility. Why? Because it requires us to do something maybe because we don't feel like it, we're lazy, it's too hard, we don't have help, which is a lie. But I'm afraid I may not fulfill this responsibility to the best of my ability. It stresses, here, this responsibility, the terror of teaching someone else to sin. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him if a millstone were hung around his neck and if he were drowned in the depth of the sea. So it's better for us to die than to teach someone to sin. If we teach someone else to sin, he, in turn, may teach someone else to sin. And this train of sin will be set in motion with no foreseeable end. It's like dominoes. We create an effect. There's nothing more terrible than to destroy one's innocence. There's nothing more terrible than to destroy one's innocence. That's hard because we now, adults, if we want to use that term, have forgotten this innocence, have forgotten humility, have forgotten our dependence, and have forgotten our trust. Our innocence has left us, which could be a result of many, many variables. But if we are called as little children to enter into the kingdom of heaven, and we destroy someone else's innocence, this great weight, a great and heavy weight is laid on us. This millstone is hung around our necks. It is better to have, as we said, this millstone on our necks and to be drowned in the sea than to turn someone to sin. This responsibility is to give us not to teach someone else to sin. This responsibility is to not teach someone else to sin. Simple. Don't sin, or don't live your lives as a sinful life as best we can, because we are not perfect. Because our actions is what people will see, is what people will hear, and what people will imitate. Not our words, but our deeds. Yes, of course, there's sin in the world. I'm not saying there's no sin. But it's inevitable. Temptations in a world which sin has entered. But that does not lessen our responsibility of the man or woman who is the cause, who is a stumbling block being placed in the way of someone younger, of someone naive, someone innocent, someone who still has humility, who still has dependence and still has trust. What does this mean for us? It's our responsibility, therefore, to remove these stumbling blocks in front of these younger, naive, innocent, pure people, and to never place them down in front of those people again, or anyone else. So this is our responsibility, not to cause someone to sin, but to help someone to their salvation. And now, off to the lost sheep, finding the lost sheep, verses 12 to 14. Here we have what Jesus' favorite picture of God and of what God and His love is. So we have 5 qualities. Today I guess I liked pointing out these qualities, these few aspects, to help us understand more so what this means, what this passage is, and how it can help us every day in our lives. So the first quality is individual. The 99 sheep were not enough. One was out on the hillside, and the shepherd could not rest until he brought it home. This is the parable. However, a large family a parent has, he or she cannot spare one of their kids. There is not one who does not matter. How many of us are parents, and how many of us would leave one of our kids on the side of the road? Okay, good. No one raised their hands. It's a good thing. That's what Christ is saying. God is not going to leave one of His sheep, one of us, one of His children on the side of the road. He cannot be happy until He has gone out and gathered that child and brought he or she back. So that's individual, God's individual love for us. Patience. It's a hard quality to find nowadays. Sheep are proverbially foolish creatures. And last night, although it was about goats, there was this thing on Facebook that that goats, yes, they're mountain creatures, but the goat was jumping on other goats, other animals, on people, on fences, on horses, on dogs. It was just crazy to see the goat jumping all over the place. Whether or not I'm comparing a sheep as foolish, like a goat is foolish, I don't think so, but I think it was something funny to see that this goat was jumping all over the place. And it was interesting to see the animals were patient with him, or it. The animals were patient with this goat. They allowed him to jump on them. But anyway, back to the sheep. The sheep has no one but itself to blame for the danger it had gotten itself into. People are apt to have so little patience when it comes to foolish people. When they get into trouble, we are apt to say it's their own fault. They brought it on themselves. Don't waste any sympathy on fools. But God is not like that. We are foolish people. But He's not going to say, that's your fault, you have to figure it out. He's not going to say that. He's going to say, how can I help you? Come back here. Here's the road. Third, seeking. The shepherd was not content to wait for the sheep to come back. Instead, he went out and searched for it. We know that God is more wonderful than to wait for us to come crawling back to Him. Christ came to seek those who wander away, and we see that here. Let me find it. Verse 11. For the Son of Man has come to save that which was lost. The Son of Man came to save that which was lost. So He is going to come out and find us. He is going to come out and bring us back. God is not content to wait for them to come home. He goes out and searches them no matter the cost. Fourthly, rejoicing. There is nothing but joy that is exclaimed here when that one lost sheep is found. It's human never to forget people's pasts, but always sins are remembered. We always remember the worst in people, but it's very hard to remember the good in people. Why? I don't know. You let me know why that's hard. It is tough. It's always easier to remember sins than it is to remember good. But God, unlike us, puts our sins behind Him. And when we return, there's only joy. There's only joy. And now the fifth quality, and I guess the last quality here, is protecting. It is the love which seeks and which saves, the love of Christ which seeks and saves. There can be a love which ruins. There can be a love that softens, but the love of God is protecting love, which saves a man, which saves people for the service of his fellow men. There is a love, and this sacrificial love, that saves and helps us protect our fellow person. A love which makes the wanderer wise and the weak strong, the sinner pure, the captive of sin, the free man of holiness, and the vanquished by temptation, its conqueror. So, I guess to wrap up everything today, we first saw what, let's say, it means to be a child and how we are called to be children and not to say who's greatest in the kingdom. Secondly, the importance it is not to cause someone to sin and not to point out others' faults, but to pick them up, to raise them up, and to help them in their journey along the way. And thirdly, that God is always there for us. Although humans let humans down, and it happens constantly. I let people down. It's human. It's not an excuse, but I let people down. And I'm sorry. Forgive me for letting you down, if I have. It's a struggle, though. If I let you down, help me not to let you down again. I need help. Just as much, if not more, than you need help. We are here to help each other and to go find that lost sheep and to bring that person back. So I will finish with a quote. In every child, there are infinite possibilities for good or for ill, for evil. It is the supreme responsibility of the parent, of the teacher, of the church, of every one of us to see that this child's dynamic responsibilities and possibilities are for good and are realized. We only want the best for our kids. Why wouldn't we want the same for the person sitting next to us? Why wouldn't we want the same for the person who cut us off in traffic? Why wouldn't we want to help that person find the good in themselves? To stifle them and to leave them untapped, to twist them into evil powers, is a sin. God's love is forever and will always guide us towards Him. Thank you.
Ευχαριστούμε εσύ.